In 1800, America's population was approximately 5.3 million. By 1830, it had more than doubled. In that same period, the country added 8 new states. Since the Lewis and Clark expedition, Americans looked westward, all the way to the Pacific coast. But their immediate interest lay in the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. Just west of that was what Americans called Indian Territory. In 1830, that name took on a whole new meaning. A law was passed, the Indian Removal Act, which meant that native tribes in the southeast would soon be forced to migrate west of the Mississippi. For many, the terrible journey would come to be known as the Trail of Tears. From the beginning of the American Republic, native tribes posed a great challenge. Could the country coexist with the tribes, acknowledging them as independent nations, or would the natives have to assimilate into the mainstream of American life? Washington and Jefferson both thought coexistence was possible if the tribes became, in their terms, civilized. By that, they intended the natives to adopt political, economic, and religious practices more or less consistent with American sensibilities. Jefferson, the first president to envision American expansion all the way to the Pacific coast, was also the first to ponder a land exchange, where the native tribes in the east would move to west of the Mississippi. It was Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, however, who oversaw its execution, although in a manner not envisioned by Jefferson. Jackson was elected in 1828. 2 years later, he signed into law the Indian Removal Act. The law was intended to force the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, and Seminoles from their lands that lay between the original American colonies and the Mississippi River. They were the 5 principal tribes of the American Southeast. By the 1830s, they were also known as the 5 civilized tribes, so called for the traits they shared with their white neighbors: centralized governments and written constitutions, established towns, farms, and participation in the American marketplace. Many had adopted Christianity. Members of each of the 5 tribes owned black slaves. The Indian Removal Act was not passed without some significant resistance. Most vocal in the Congress was Tennessee Representative Davy Crockett. The frontiersman would lose re-election in 1835, due largely to his opposition to the Indian Removal Act. Shortly afterward, he left for Texas, where he died a year later, defending the Alamo. As the groundswell for removal grew, there emerged one possible source of interruption. Samuel Lawson Worcester, a Vermont native, was a congregational minister. In 1823, he was sent to the American Southeast as a missionary to the Cherokees. A year after the Indian Removal Act, Worcester was working on a translation of the Bible into Cherokee, and he had helped the tribe found the first Native American newspaper, the Phoenix. He was in violation, however, of Georgia's prohibition on being on Indian land without an official permission from the state. Twice he was arrested. The second time, Worcester was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years of hard labor. Fellow missionary Eleazar Butler was arrested and sentenced as well. Worcester challenged Georgia's law. His case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. On March 3, 1832, in a 6-1 majority decision written by Chief Justice John Marshall, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Worcester. Marshall decided that since the Cherokee Nation was in fact an independent nation, the preacher was allowed to be on Cherokee land without authorization from the state of Georgia. For the time being, however, the ruling had no impact. Neither President Jackson nor the state of Georgia honored it. By the summer of 1832, Cherokee factions developed. One faction advocated for voluntary removal to Indian Territory. The other, led by Chief John Ross, vowed to fight removal. Their division would last for years, well after removal took hold. Samuel Worcester and Eleazar Butler remained in prison until January 14, 1833. At that point, they asked their attorneys to stop trying to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. In 1835, the federal government negotiated for the Cherokee lands. What developed was the Treaty of New Echota, named after the capital city of the Cherokee Nation. The treaty was struck on December 29, 1835. Under its terms, the Cherokee exchanged their lands east of the Mississippi River for $5 million and new homelands in Oklahoma. On May 23, 1836, the Senate narrowly passed the treaty. Neither John Ross nor any of the other Cherokee chiefs were present at the negotiation, only a faction called the Treaty Party. Ross did not think the treaty was binding. President Martin Van Buren did, and in May 1838, he took action to remove the Cherokees. Under the command of General Winfield Scott, 7,000 federal forces began rounding up the natives and placing them in stockades. That summer, the Cherokee began the 800-mile trek to northeast Oklahoma. There were two main points of departure, Ross's Landing in Tennessee and Gunter's Landing in Alabama. Each site was on the Tennessee River. Although much of the journey could be accomplished by boat, the river levels were too low, forcing most of the natives to travel by foot. Approximately 16,000 Cherokees were removed to Indian Territory. An estimated 4,000 died on the way. Among the survivors, Chief John Ross arrived in 1839. Shortly afterward, he was elected chief of the reconstituted Cherokee Nation. Samuel Worcester moved to live with the Cherokee in the new Indian Territory. He continued to translate the Bible into Cherokee and helped the tribe publish its newspaper. He also helped to mediate between the two factions who remained divided over Indian removal. In 1859, Worcester died in Park Hill, Indian Territory. He was laid to rest there. Chief John Ross died in Washington, D.C., while negotiating a treaty between the Cherokee Nation and the United States. He, too, was laid to rest in Park Hill.